Welcome to the final round. I think we should give a big hand to Clemson University, University of Miami for making it this far. Take a moment to have each of the participants introduce themselves and the judges as well.
My name is Haley Cornfield. I'm a junior at the University of Miami, majoring in American Studies, Political Science, and minoring in Spanish.
Hi, my name is Robert Levine. I'm also a junior. I'm majoring in accounting, finance, and economics.
I'm Josh Cornfield, Haley's little brother. I'm a sophomore in University of Miami, majoring in international studies and poli-sci.
I'm Ashley Carnes, senior, University of Miami, majoring in international relations.
I'm Calla Jean from Clemson, and I'm majoring in political science.
I'm Marge Dickelson. I'm from Clemson. I'm an English major and philosophy minor.
I'm Taylor Reeves. I'm a sophomore, and I'm an English and history double major.
I'm Anna Little, sophomore at Clemson, mechanical engineering major, chemistry minor.
I'm Kevin Payne, and I'm an economics major. I'm a senior.
I'm Mike Williams. I'm a judge. I'm a columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper.
I'm Tony Ellis, another judge. I'm a philosopher from VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University.
I'm Sandra Pearton. I'm the Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies.
Okay, Kayla, I'm going to ask you to call it the air, okay? It's kind of hard to tell, but I think it's tails. It's tails.
We elect to be the second team.
You would like to be the second team. Okay. Clemson University then will be team 1. University of Miami, team 2. Team 1 envelope. Team 1, your case is case number 15. Your question is, are airlines morally justified in implementing a surcharge for obese passengers? If so, why? If not, why not? I'll pass these out. I'm going to read the question one more time.
Thank you.
Case number 15, are airlines morally justified in implementing a surcharge for obese passengers? If so, why? If not, why not? Clemson, you have 2 minutes to confer and then 10 minutes to present.
Thank you.
10 minutes to respond, and at 1 minute I'll give you a signal, okay? Beginning now.
In response to the question, are airlines morally justified in implementing a surcharge for obese passengers? Clemson contends that yes, airlines are morally justified in implementing this policy. We'll base our contention on the welfare principle, which holds that people's autonomy can be restricted if it will have benefits to others, and the theory of comparative justice, which holds that people should receive that to which they are entitled. We'd like to make some qualifications on our contention in that although they are justified in this practice, they should take care to ensure minimal embarrassment of the overweight passengers. So we sort of have a conditional argument that it's not ethically justified for them to implement this policy without regard to them, but given that they take appropriate measures to ensure minimal embarrassment, they are morally justified in this policy. Before we begin the arguments, we'd like to sort of outline a standard policy of one of the airlines. We use Southwest for the example. Their defining factor for a customer of size, as they're called, is whether or not the passenger can fit into a single seat with both armrests in the lower position. So if the passenger can sit down and lower both armrests, they will not be required to purchase an additional ticket. However, if they cannot lower both armrests when sitting, then they will be required to purchase an additional ticket at a reduced cost, a child's fare. And in the event that the flight does not fill up, then they will be refunded the full price of the second ticket, which happens 98% of the time in Southwest's case. So only in a small 2% of cases are the overweight passenger actually required to purchase an additional ticket. So with this in mind, I'd like to move on to our first argument based on the welfare principle, which, as we said, states that a person's autonomy can be restricted if it will have benefits to other people. In this case, we believe that the autonomy of the overweight person to purchase a single ticket can be restricted because of the benefits it will have to their neighbors. As we mentioned, the defining factor is whether or not you can lower the armrest. So if a person who this policy applies to is allowed to only purchase one ticket, they will necessarily have to raise the armrest and will necessarily take up part of their neighbor's seat. Clemson believes that this is unfair to require their neighbors to have to put up with somebody taking part of their seat that they paid for. And so that's why we believe that they are morally justified in requiring them to purchase two tickets. An analogous situation can be seen in employment law. Bona fide occupational qualification is a condition that employers can look for in hiring employees that might otherwise seem discriminatory when taken in other contexts. For example, if Victoria's Secret were hiring an underwear model, they can claim that being a woman is a bona fide occupational qualification for employment because the underwear is intended to be worn by women and women are going to be the ones purchasing it. So it would seem kind of ridiculous to have a man model the underwear. So in this case, it's not discriminatory towards the man because the product is intended for the woman. So in this case, it seems that being small enough to fit into a single seat is a similar sort of bona fide qualification, and that if you're unable to fit into a single seat with both armrests lowered, then you do not meet the qualifications for only purchasing one ticket. And therefore, we believe that the airlines are justified in requiring that these passengers purchase an additional ticket. We'd also like to point out that there are some safety issues involved when allowing an overweight passenger to only purchase one ticket. As we stated, these passengers cannot fit into the confines of one seat, and so will have to sort of squeeze into the seat if they are allowed to purchase one ticket. And we believe that in the event of an emergency, if a speedy exit is required, then it might be more difficult for a passenger who is wedged into a seat that they really can't physically fit into to exit the plane and might endanger themselves as well as other passengers. In essence, it's sort of putting the plane over capacity. You can sort of essentially think of this person as two people, and so if a plane has a set amount of seats that they believe is a sufficient number for, in the case of an emergency, that could get out, allowing an overweight passenger to sit in a seat is essentially putting the plane over capacity by one person. And so we believe that it would be ethical for the airlines to require them to purchase an additional ticket because of the benefits it will have to them as well as their neighbors. So, with this in mind, we'll move to our second argument, which is based on the theory of comparative justice, which holds that people should receive that to which they are entitled. And in this case, we are claiming that everyone who purchases a ticket is entitled to full use of their seat. We kind of struggled with this a little bit and said, well, maybe purchasing a ticket doesn't entitle you to a seat. Maybe purchasing a ticket only entitles you to passage from one place to another. Why does a ticket necessarily entitle you to a full use of a seat? And we feel that an example that kind of exemplifies why is when you compare it to a bus. when you load a bus, you pay at the door to get on the bus, and you're not really assigned a seat. You're not saying, okay, C5, this is your seat, go sit in this seat. You are just merely granted access to get on the bus. And in the event that the bus fills up, you're allowed to stand on the bus so long as there's enough room for people to pack into the bus without coming out the door, basically, then you're allowed on the bus. Whereas an airline, they give you a specific seat and say, okay, you are supposed to sit in A5 or J13 or whatever it is, and this is the seat that you're supposed to sit in. You're not allowed to stand up if you feel like it. You can't say, well, the plane's filled up, but I don't mind standing. It's sort of a safety issue. So we feel that if you purchase one ticket, then you're entitled to full use of your seat. Another objection that sort of came up was that, well, ticket prices fluctuate widely. You can be sitting next to somebody and have paid twice as much as they did, depending on when they bought the ticket. And it would seem that, well, if you pay a higher price, maybe you're not entitled to the same rights that they are. However, these ticket fluctuations are common knowledge, and people are aware of them before loading the plane. And if they feel that the ticket is unfairly high, then they have the option of deciding not to purchase it and maybe drive or take a later flight. However, once they've boarded the plane and realize they are seated next to an overweight passenger who is necessarily going to encroach on their right, they no longer have the option of taking a later flight or driving because they're already committed in the airplane. We've also considered that maybe the airplanes could revamp their fleet and maybe add in a couple extra seats or maybe increase the size of all the seats. However, we feel that this would also be unfair to the neighboring passengers and the average size passenger who is not overweight, because there's substantial costs involved in completely revamping an entire fleet of airlines. And these costs would be seen in higher ticket prices for all passengers, not just the overweight passengers. And so we feel it's unfair to burden the average size passengers with higher ticket prices because of the small minority of passengers who can't fit into their seats. We also feel that if there are several seats available that are larger, that everybody should have equal access to them. They shouldn't be merely restricted to overweight passengers just because they're overweight. If they're available for the same price, then we feel that everybody, even average-sized passengers, should have access to them, because if the overweight passenger really wants more space, then they can upgrade to first class where they'll have bigger seats. So with these two arguments in mind, we'd like to kind of make the qualification that while the airlines are morally justified in implementing this policy, we believe that they should take care to ensure minimal embarrassment to the overweight passengers. And we're going to hold this through the principle of non-maleficence, which holds that people should act in ways that cause no harm. So in this case, we believe that the airlines should act in ways that cause no harm to the overweight passengers. Because many tickets are purchased online today, we feel that the airline should clearly advertise this policy in the process of buying the ticket. Most of the airlines that are mentioned in the case have the policy stated on their website, but it never comes up in the process of purchasing the ticket. So you could buy a plane ticket and then be completely unaware of this policy and then not realize until you get to the plane or until you get to the airport and are trying to load the plane that this policy is actually in place. And that would of course be very embarrassing to be called out of line and say, sir, look, you're going to have to buy an extra ticket, or if the flight is filled up, they won't even be allowed to board and they'll have to wait either for another plane later on or some other sort of arrangement. So we feel that they should clearly state it on the website so that the passenger can purchase the additional ticket. We also believe that they should maybe state like a waist size, saying if your waist is bigger than this amount, then you're probably going to need to purchase an additional ticket. When they get to the airport, we believe that the airline should have some sort of separate room out of the view of the public where if the customer believes that maybe this apply, maybe it won't apply, they can go to this separate room where they have a sample seat set up that the person can sit in. So that if they are able to sit in the seat and lower the armrest, then they will be refunded the price of the second ticket, and then if not, they would just go on as they were. So this saves the person the embarrassment of being called out of line or being confronted in front of total strangers and saying, look, you're going to need to purchase an additional ticket because of your weight. So in conclusion, we feel that this practice is morally justifiable based on the welfare principle, which holds that people's autonomy can be restricted because of the benefits to others. We believe that the benefits of the overweight passengers' neighbors will outweigh the extra cost or the extra price they will have to pay of the ticket, and through the theory of comparative justice, because we believe that purchasing one ticket entitles you to full use of your seat, and that these overweight passengers will necessarily encroach on their neighbor's seat if not allowed to purchase one ticket.
You
University of Miami, you now have 1 minute to confer. Are you ready?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me just set my timer here. 5 minutes starting now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Clemson. That was a very interesting analysis of the topic. We agree with you on most of the issues that you raised. The primary deficiency that we found in the case was that in most ethical situations, we examine the ethics of a situation through the point of view from a variety of stakeholders. And we feel that the point of view of obese people was pretty much overlooked with regard to the question that was asked. The question that was asked was, are airlines morally justified in implementing a surcharge for obese passengers? Pretty much the only reference made to the obese person's point of view was in the non-maleficence factor of their case, which was to minimize embarrassment, which is irrelevant to the question. The question asks whether it would be justified to assign a surcharge to obese people, and we feel crucial to an analysis of this question is just some type of analysis from the point of view of the obese person on why they are entitled to more of a seat or why they shouldn't be entitled to more of a seat, but from their perspective, or using them as the point around which your analysis centers. They examined the point of view of the airline's ability to profit and the relative comfort of passengers sitting next to obese people. But we think that important questions to ask relating to obese people is that some of these people are born with natural causes that explain their obesity. So why should we discriminate against people who are born with naturally caused obesity? We wouldn't discriminate against people with other health conditions or tallness or various other conditions. We'd expect them to, society to take care of them to a certain extent with reference to care ethics, but we don't expect the same for the obese passenger. And we don't necessarily mean that changes their position. We primarily agree with them, but we feel that it's absolutely necessary to an analysis of the question to examine the point of view of the obese passenger as a necessary stakeholder.
Furthering on that, if we were to analyze it from what they had proposed and we looked at their idea of comparative justice, we see that it's very analogous to using what we consume and what resources in society we consume. I mean, we predicate pricing off of a scarce amount of resources and supply and demand based off of that. I mean, the most stringent type of demand would be an airplane. There's a limited amount of seats. You can't create more seats on an aircraft. So the airline is justified in that perspective. However, if we looked at what causes an obese person to be obese, whether it be chronic or not, we see that it would play some sort of role, and that's why Clemson and ourselves would justify charging them a reduced fare because of that, because we don't think they should shoulder the entire burden of that, but they should still protect the airlines. They also forgot to talk about the airlines and their shareholders. They talked about why we should charge them more, but they didn't justify why we should charge them. They said it's because of comparative justice and receive what we're entitled to some degree. But to more of an extent, the airline is an organization, it's a profit-seeking entity, and as such, it has a right to make a profit. It has a right to make revenue off of the services that it renders. And this service is transporting people from one place to another. And if someone is rightfully put out of a seat because an obese passenger is occupying the second seat, they are entitled to some sort of profit. And it is important that we recognize this from an airline perspective. Also, more importantly, we have to analyze this from an average person perspective, an average-sized person who's sitting on the aircraft next to that obese person. It is in everyone's best interest to have free flow throughout the cabin and to have the space they paid for. We made this very similar to a farmer owning land. If there's two farmers with 100 acres of land, the same amount of cattle, and my neighbor buys 20 more cattle, It's not my obligation to provide my land for him to let his cattle graze upon. So this brings us to the idea of utilitarianism. We're trying to maximize the most good for the most amount of people. In this way, we have not only the airline benefiting from the increased revenue, but also the passengers, both obese and average. Also, they neglected to mention Canada, in which everyone rides for free, no matter how many seats. They don't ride for free. You pay for one seat, and if you take up 2 or 3 seats, you get 2 or 3 seats. The problem with this is it creates an incredibly embarrassing situation for the obese passenger, like they mentioned, and also undercuts the revenues of the airline.
Clemson, you have 1 minute to confer. Clemson, you have 5 minutes to respond to the commentary starting now.
All right, we'd like to thank the University of Miami for their commentary. That was very good, but we're a bit confused why you said our principle of non-maleficence was ethically irrelevant and then continue to make your main point that we should consider the point of view of the obese passengers. As we said with the principle of non-maleficence, their point of view is important. However, we feel that their neighboring passengers' point of view is more important. So while we did not explicitly call it utilitarianism, that's basically what our argument was composed of. In the event, or in further regards to the passengers, we noted in the beginning that 98% of the time in Southwestern's case, and in most airlines, I don't have an exact number for the other ones, they were refunded the price of the ticket if the airline did not fill up. So there's only a very small percentage of the time where this policy actually affects the overweight passenger. If the airline does not fill up, they will accommodate them and put them next to an empty seat. In addition to your point about the airline's profit motive, we like to point out that the overweight passengers are required to pay a child's fare. It seems like you're kind of hinting at the opportunity cost of the passenger who is not allowed to sit in that seat. So if an overweight passenger is taking up a seat, that's one more passenger that the airline can't charge a ticket for. So they seem to be losing money from the missed opportunity of charging to that passenger. However, as we noted, they are required to pay a child's fare, which sort of takes into account the fact that an airline does not only account for the seat. The price of a ticket also accounts for the complimentary food, the services of the people that push the cars back and forth, and the actual flight. So they're not charged a full additional ticket price. They're charged a reduced price that will partially compensate the company for the opportunity cost of the lost passenger, as well as be fair to the overweight passenger so that they do not pay for the actual service of flying twice. One main thing that we struggle with that you pointed out in that obesity is oftentimes genetic, and a lot of people can't control this. This is an issue that comes up, however we feel in regards to utilitarianism, that the benefits of the neighbor outweigh the negative effects to the overweight passenger. To bring up another example of somebody who can't help something, say somebody is born a quadriplegic or a paraplegic and has to use a wheelchair. In this case, the airlines accommodate them by having set places for wheelchairs to park. We feel the difference in this case is that the person in the wheelchair has no other option. There is no second seat for them to purchase. They are required by their condition to only have the one option of sitting in the front in a specified place and being strapped down, whereas the overweight person has the option of purchasing the second ticket. So while it is still disadvantageous to the overweight passenger, in the event that they can't control it, it's sort of just an inherent side effect that we feel really can't be accounted for. As to the shareholders, we have mentioned that the higher cost of rebanking the airplanes will be shown in higher ticket prices. That's sort of a basic tenet of economics. Your marginal cost rises, the price you charge is going to rise. And so it seems that we have sort of addressed this as well as the child's fare thing. It's accounting for the opportunity cost of that other passenger. In regards to the Canada argument, we really are sort of confused what you're talking about, because that was basically what our entire case was about, that the practice that Canada is participating in is unethical. We don't feel that they should allow people to take up more than one seat if they only purchase one ticket. So we're just kind of confused exactly what you had in mind there.
Basically, when you do say that we didn't examine the ethical situation from different viewpoints, we'd like to say that we did, because there is a great benefit to the obese passengers having the necessary space. And that's a part of our calculation in this, knowing that they need that space and they'll have it if we promote this policy. And also for the shareholders, part of what you brought up, following on what he said, is that we're not saying why they need to pay another ticket, but we find that to be pretty much an understood concept. And we find it common knowledge that an airline makes money by selling the individual seats on a plane. And obviously, if they're going to have a person taking up more than one seat, they need people paying for both seats. So after that, we're still going to follow with the principle, the welfare principle, saying that we're going to be able to have a lot of benefit for most of the people on the plane, benefit to the neighbors, and also take into account minimum harm to the obese person, promoting benefits for them having the space. And by comparative justice, people paying their flight fee, they'll have what they've paid for. And through that and non-maleficence, not embarrassing, we find this relevant because this is part of why we justify it morally, saying it is morally justified if there's no harm done and the embarrassment is kept. And that is why we find that point to be morally relevant.
Thanks.
It's now time for the judges' question period. I'll ask them to confer briefly, and they'll each ask, if they so choose, one question with no more than a brief follow-up.
Thank you. I want to push you on this welfare principle that you mentioned and ask you whether you would extend that to other situations. If people get on a plane and cough, or if they take young children on a plane who cry, sometimes that might bother me, and I would benefit if they were not allowed to be on the plane. So I wonder if you would think that the principle applies in that situation as well.
In response, we'd like to point out 2 points. The first one is that we feel with the overweight passengers, requiring them to purchase an additional ticket is sort of a viable alternative that, while not ideal, is actually viable. We feel that banning babies from being on a plane or saying somebody smells too bad to come on an airplane is not as viable. We don't think that just because you have a baby, you should be forced to drive from here to California, or whereas the overweight passengers have the option of purchasing 2 tickets. So it does burden them. Maybe what the airlines could do was charge a surcharge for people who have babies. We feel that that could actually be maybe morally justifiable. If you make it more expensive for somebody who has a baby to come on a plane, then maybe they will be more likely to drive somewhere. So I guess in response to your question,
also, there's a difference, and there's a safety issue when people are blocking more room than there should be, or when there's too many people in a designated space. And also, sounds and scents coming into one space is probably a less severe encroachment in that area than physical encroachment. And we see the difference in that, and that's how we weigh it into justifying a surcharge for obese passengers on an airplane.
There seems to be a lot of agreement around at the moment, so I want to ask you a very general question, and actually something that you didn't raise specifically initially, or perhaps you did, but University of Miami raised it for you. You seem to accept the principle of stakeholders, and that the obese were, you sometimes said shareholders, but I think occasionally you meant stakeholders, that the obese were stakeholders in this issue. I wonder how you define stakeholders. I mean, I take it a stakeholder isn't just anyone who has an interest in something. It's someone who has a legitimate interest in something. And how do we identify who has a legitimate interest in outcomes as opposed to just who has an interest? For instance, bank robbers have an interest in getting away with the goods. They don't have a legitimate interest in that. How do we make that distinction? And how do we apply it to a particular case?
The stakeholders would be the different parties involved in this, which would be the passengers on the plane, including the obese and the normal weight passengers, as well as people in the corporation for the airline, the Southwest airline, the policies. But regardless of the stakeholders, they have to abide by the policies that are set forth by the company when they're choosing to ride on this plane to a different location. That's a choice that they make. So they may be stakeholders, but as stakeholders, they're entering into a situation where they'll abide by policies. And we still feel like the policies that are proposed right now to provide an extra surcharge to provide the space would be of benefit to any of the stakeholders and of equal benefit to the people running the company.
In addition, the way I took them to mean stakeholders was corporate stockholders, as in people who rely on these ticket prices for some sort of profit motive. And I was pointing out that the higher cost of the ticket would be seen in higher prices, so it would really not have any effect on those stakeholders. But it doesn't seem that that's exactly what you're talking about. So could you kind of clarify exactly what you mean?
No, I was hoping you would qualify it.
Okay.
I mean, there is a lot of talk in ethics about who the stakeholders are in a particular issue. And you might think, the general definitions of stakeholders are those who have a legitimate interest in the outcome, not just those who have an interest in the outcome. And another way to put this would be, why do the obese, for instance, have any particular right to have their obesity taken into account? Why do coughers have any right to have their coughing taken into account? It's a question of what legitimate rights people have, not just what rights they have. And I wonder how the obese get into this picture.
Okay, well, adding to what she said, we feel that all parties involved will be stakeholders in this. The neighbors to the overweight passengers have a stake in it because, as we've pointed out, they've purchased their ticket and should be allowed to expect full use of their seat. Whereas if they're seated next to an overweight passenger who is allowed to only purchase one ticket, then they're necessarily going to forfeit part of their seat to that passenger. In the case of the overweight passenger, they of course have a stake because they're having to pay, in some cases substantially more, at least as much as a child would pay, in order to sit, so they have more of a financial stake, where the neighboring passengers have more of an emotional and physical proximity stake. The airlines have a stake in this, as we noted, because of the profit motive. If they were required by some sort of government agency to actually revamp all of their airlines, we've noted this would be pretty expensive and they would have to raise prices in order to cover these costs. So we believe that they have a stake in this because they could potentially lose money if maybe they were some sort of like pricing was set where they couldn't raise the prices anymore, but yet still had to accommodate these overweight passengers. So we feel that in this case, all the parties that we've brought up have a legitimate stake in it.
One last chance. Yeah.
That was one pause, all you get. Sorry.
All right.
You mentioned the idea, you brought up the idea of larger seats and rejected that as too onerous for profit-seeking companies to be interested in. Now we have public and private sector organizations, businesses, government entities who have made accommodations for the handicapped in buildings, accommodations, access. Buses that provide lifts for the handicapped. And if they're able to do that, they're not charging the handicapped extra for that. That's something we all bear, I guess, if there's a cost associated with it. If that's the case and we accept that at least some obesity is related to medical condition, why shouldn't the airlines take that on as a larger good?
In regards to the handicapped, we feel that requiring the overweight passengers to purchase an additional seat, as we said, is a viable alternative. Airlines actually do accommodate handicappeds in a wheelchair at no extra cost. In regards to the public domain, we feel that airlines are in the private sector for a reason. Public companies don't have the incentives that private companies do to perform. Compare FedEx to, say, the United States Postal Service. Obviously, FedEx is a much more efficient company, or any of the UPS, and can ship your mail a lot faster than the United States Postal Service does. Where there is no danger for the United States Postal Service to be slow, if you put airlines into the public domain, this might be stretching it a little bit, but there could be significant safety issues if you take your average postal worker and put him in charge of running an airline. It seems that they might not be they don't have the financial incentives as a profit-maximizing company does to ensure that, I guess, customers return to them. If you take airlines out of the private domain and replace it with one governmental airplane, they will not, I guess, have the incentive to be as safe as a private company will.
45 seconds. Do you want to follow up?
Well, I'm not suggesting that they go into the public domain, although they are publicly regulated. I'm just suggesting that this is a cost they could take on, like other private for-profit companies do, and not directly charge the people who are involved.
25 seconds.
We feel like because of the safety issues that can come when you put that many people on a plane, just the difficulties that can happen, and the cost that it would be, because it's a private industry, they have the choice, and we don't feel that right now, since there's another viable option, that they're necessarily morally justified or obligated to make larger seats. If there's another option that works just as well by just charging a little bit more, and the other option is going to be charging just as much, then.
Can we give the judges a few minutes or less to finalize scoring to this point in the round? I like to have the scrap paper from this first case. Do you have sufficient scrap paper left for the? Would you like more?
Oh, I have some right there.
Perfect.
Fine.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Do you have enough paper? Would you like more?
Yes, I'd like to. Wait.
We have some.
Judges, let me know when you're ready. Okay. Now on to Team 2 case, University of Miami. Your case is case number 13. Your question is, are medical professionals justified in overseeing and providing medical attention associated with harsh interrogation practices? If so, why? If not, why not? I'll give you a copy of the case and I'll reread the question.
Thank you.
Case number 13. Are medical professionals justified in overseeing and providing medical attention associated with harsh interrogation practices? If so, why? If not, why not? University of Miami, you now have 10 minutes to present, starting now.
Thank you very much. It's such a privilege to be here and be in the company of all of you. So in answering the question, are medical professionals justified in overseeing and providing medical attention associated with harsh interrogation practices? We argue primarily that you cannot justify medical professionals overseeing and providing medical attention associated with harsh interrogation practices, unless, here's the key caveat, unless their presence diminishes the chances of harsh interrogation or torture or some type of rights abuses being inflicted on these suspects involved in the situation. So we believe that you can only justify their presence if it diminishes the harshness of the interrogation tactic. There was an article in June in the Washington Post that talked about how medical professionals are providing medical records to torturers or to interrogators to make it easier or make their interrogation techniques more efficient. And actually, they would, the interrogators and the torturers would use the causes of underlying health conditions as a justification for certain causes of death when these suspects died as a result of the interrogation techniques. And they would explain it away like an underlying cardiovascular condition. But this is essentially the death penalty without due process or a trial, because let's remember that suspects that we're talking about, mainly, I think a good example are suspects in Guantanamo Bay, are just suspects. They're not found guilty. If you consider the principle of retributive justice, they can only be punished for acts they've certainly committed or a trial has found that they committed, and not punished for any other reasons. But this article also talked about how medical professionals would interfere in interrogation techniques to prevent suspects maybe from drowning when they were being waterboarded. And the sole motivation of the medical professionals when they interfered was to make sure that the suspects would stay alive for another day so they could provide more information. The Red Cross declared that this is a gross breach of medical ethics because their concern for the suspects was driven not out of a beneficent desire to help their patients, but out of a desire to ensure that the military professionals located at Guantanamo Bay got access to more information. Essentially, the suspects at these sites are the doctor's patients, and it's the doctor's sworn duty to provide care to these patients. There have been doctors at these sites who have told suspects that they wouldn't provide care if they were in pain or they were near death unless these suspects provided information to interrogators. This is essentially a form of torture in itself, and we find this grossly unethical. There's a key question of what is a doctor's fundamental role, and we assert that a doctor's fundamental role is to provide care to his or her patient. And if a doctor doesn't provide care to his or her patient, then they're in violation of their fundamental role. And this fundamental role is actually clearer when it comes to doctors than when it comes to maybe an example of librarians who burn books, or teachers who try and make their students more ignorant, or scientists who try and destroy research. Because it's basically a sworn duty of doctors. Many doctors take oaths upon graduating from medical school that they're not going to inflict any harm on potential patients. And it's expected of all doctors, necessary for a doctor-patient bond, when you approach a doctor, that you expect that they're going to provide beneficent care and consider what is in your own best interest, and not try and manipulate you or torture you or coerce you. It is also key in the fundamental role of a doctor to have independent judgment based off of knowledge and experience in order to treat each individual patient. And when doctors report to military authorities, like in Guantanamo Bay, they aren't using their independent judgment in dealing with the patient. They're just a puppet for another figure, and their fundamental role is compromised. And when doctors oversee torture, as is referenced to in the question, then they are allowing for torture to occur without interference, and they might actually legitimize the torture or harsh interrogation techniques that occur. Let's be clear on the definition before it becomes an issue. It's possible that you can classify harsh interrogation techniques as torture. It's possible that you decide not to classify them as torture. But we will classify harsh interrogation techniques as techniques that cause harm to individuals. And I think that all of our arguments encompass this causing of harm. When doctors graduate from medical school, the medical schools expect them to use the body of knowledge that they obtain there to use it only for positive beneficent good to the patients that they will later see. There's actually some doctors swear by the Hippocratic Oath and other medical oaths upon graduating from medical school that say basically, quote, do no harm to future patients. Harsh interrogation techniques like torture in general cause harm, which is a violation of the principle of non-maleficence. It's a violation of Kant's categorical imperative because you're using the suspects as means to an end in order to save lives, which is dehumanizing to the suspect on a certain account. Let's consider this. When we consider animal ethics, using animals in experiments, usually we justify the using of animals that if we cause certain harm to animals, at least it's justified because we're going to save plentiful lives in the future. But that restricts harsh treatment of animals. We use those animal ethics in scientific experiments, yet there's a certain double standard when it comes to terrorist suspects or other suspects that we can cause harm to suspects if it means saving plentiful lives in the future because of a security concern as opposed to providing, using scientific knowledge to save lives. And we think that's a hypocritical double standard. Several key ethical principles that we use to justify our position. First of all, one of the most important principles at stake here is the principle of non-maleficence, because coincidentally, this principle is basically to do no harm, which is basically the same as the oaths that doctors take upon graduating from medical school. And if doctors are overseeing and providing medical attention associated with harsh interrogation techniques, they're essentially creating a certain amount of harm, inflicting an amount of harm on a suspect. The second key principle is the principles of medical ethics, which define the fundamental role of a doctor in society, which is to provide beneficent care. The doctor is in clear violation of these ethics when they don't provide care. And if they are in violation of these ethics, we think that they should be tried by state or federal law, and they should be subject to the ethical guidelines of their state medical boards, and they should probably have their licenses revoked. Another crucial principle is the principle of the Veracity Ethic, that where basically you should be honest and inform certain relevant authorities if they find that torture is occurring. In the case of hospitals in the United States, if a doctor sees that domestic violence is occurring, they're kind of expected to report this to child protection agencies in order to protect the interests of children or spouses that are abused. We feel that because the suspects in detainment facilities are also the doctor's patients, then the doctor has the same obligation to report to the proper authorities that such abuses are occurring. It should be fully brought out into the open so society can examine the ethics of it. There's also the consequential argument that torture or harsh interrogation techniques often don't provide authorities with relevant info. The information can be deliberate attempts to mislead interrogators, and if you can't even justify the use of torture or interrogation techniques with consequential arguments, then you can never, and there are all the deontological harms that it threatens, then you would never be able to justify it. And then also key to our principle is to our position is the principle of beneficence, which is the doctor's responsibility to provide care to their patients. Beneficence is the principle that if one is in a position to do good, it is their moral responsibility to provide that good. And doctors have an ethical obligation to provide good when they're at those sites. So if they are at those sites, they can provide medical attention only if they are motivated by providing a certain amount of care to the suspects. So we are in agreement with the Red Cross that if you provide care that's motivated by the patient's best interest as opposed to motivated to ensure that they live to fight another day but not really fight another day, just answer more questions, then we consider that unethical. Thank you very much.
University. You have 1 minute to confer. Start now. 5 minutes to respond. Starting now.
Okay. Well, Clemson University would first like to thank the University of Miami for their presentation. It was very interesting, and there were a few things that we were a little bit unclear on. The first was specifically the way that you answered the question. And you said that doctors can be there only if their presence diminishes the chance of torture or the violation of human rights. And then you later went on to say that harsh interrogation is meant to harm. And harming in order to get information is essentially the definition of torture. So you're saying that they're justified in being there if they're preventing what they're there to witness, which we find a little bit contradictory and difficult. And if what you meant was that they should be there in order to diminish the chance of certain types of harm to the detainees, to their patients, that Clemson University also has some difficulties with this because history has shown us that this is not a viable option. As we saw in Guantanamo Bay, in many other countries, doctors generally do not act in that way. As the case states, doctors are no more ethical than other people. And there are a number of, for example, psychological studies that show why this isn't just a case of a few bad apples, why this is a bad situation. First, the Stanley Milgram's authority experiments. Basically, what this experiment was, they told people that if they pushed a button, they would deliver an electric shock to someone in another room. And they were told by the scientists when to push the button and to continue pushing the button. And they knew that this caused pain because they heard screaming from the other room. And yet people continued to push the button even though they knew they were causing harm. And so this study shows that people are very susceptible to authority, even if it's something that they know is wrong. They'll continue to do it if they have an authority figure telling them to do it. And in the case of doctors, you have, for example, military authorities telling them to do it. And then the doctors then tell torturers, for example, it's okay to do this particular form of torture, which is generally their role. They say, this is what you should do, they put out plans, that sort of thing. So they're then essentially supporting torture in the minds of the torturers, which then leads to the torturers acting more harshly than they otherwise possibly would have. And then another interesting study that is very pertinent to this is Filson Bardot's Stanford prison experiment. In this experiment, he randomly assigned a group of college-age students, one as prisoners and one as guards, to see how they would interact. And he tested them beforehand to make sure they were not insane, make sure they were normal, reasonable people. And they found that within 6 days, the guards had so taken in their role as guards that they were dehumanizing the prisoners. They were forcing them to do push-ups naked, sit in a hole in isolation in the dark for days, denying them food, all kinds of things. And there was no difference between these two people other than an arbitrary assignment. And in the case of a doctor being in the room as someone is being tortured, this doctor will grow to see someone who's supposed to be their patient as a prisoner, as an enemy of the state. And this is not something that Clemson University feels should be encouraged.
We also have a question about the fact that medical professionals are not justified in being there unless the presence diminishes rights abuses. And we feel like this is a poor stipulation because we'd have to know ahead of time what kind of torture will be undertaken to know if the doctor's presence will limit abuses. If we have, say, electric shock torture or waterboarding, it seems that the doctor's presence there would alleviate some harms. However, certain harsh interrogation tactics that might be harsh or maybe even perhaps a little more benign, the doctor's presence might be irrelevant in these cases. So your caveat depends on the fact of the nature of the torture or the type of the torture, and Clemson fears that this sometimes yes, sometimes no calculation is simply a little too middle of the line. At an issue of this magnitude, we feel that we need a clearer caveat and we just have who's going to determine the degree of human rights abuses to say whether the doctor there will actually alleviate or their presence would be irrelevant.
And we do feel like there's a better stance that we would take in saying they're there for treatment after, and they can be there to care for the patient, which would uphold your principle of non-maleficence and the Hippocratic Oath, meaning that they would be there for the treatment of their patient. And our question to you is that when a patient or the prisoner, detainee, wants to live, which most humans have that survival instinct, but providing treatment to them would keep them alive and subject them to further possible torture, what's the doctor to do? We still think that the most important care is the care of the patient and the health of their...
University of Miami, you have 1 minute to confer. Yep. Let me set my slide. You have 5 minutes to respond to the commentary starting now.
Okay. There are 6 primary arguments that we want to get to. The first argument was this confusion about whether a doctor is justified in being in a certain location if they're only there to diminish harm. And there was confusion about this because the doctor knows that harm will be occurring in that location and is there only to restrain it. But I would offer a parallel of military officials or other officials who work in conjunction with the military, who stationed with the military, know that potential human rights violations will occur, but they exist there to act as a form of check to prevent more egregious human rights violations from occurring in the future. So we think that this is a very reasonable standard that doctors who understand their fundamental role as to provide beneficent care to patients can be in places where they know that harm will occur, but in order to prevent harm from occurring. There were 2 arguments that I'd like to group that they made about Stanley Milgram and some Bardot's prison experiments, and we don't really recognize why those are relevant to justifying medical professionals' role in harsh interrogation practices, because we don't justify things based on natural psychological expectations of people. A lot of ethical justifications are dependent on people suppressing basic animalistic desires, natural desires, and conforming to a general societal code of morality and proper treatment. And these medical ethics aren't organic. We would never argue that these medical ethics are organic and occur naturally. It's our argument that they were created by society in order to protect the interests of the patient, and they're absolutely necessary. So these 2 arguments are irrelevant. They made an argument that the doctor's presence might encourage torture to occur because it would validate the process that the interrogators are practicing. And while we recognize that it's possible that this would occur, we wouldn't justify the doctor's presence if it only validated the actions of the interrogators. We would only justify it if it was a hindrance to the interrogators in their efforts to harm potential suspects. They argue that our position is impractical because the doctors won't know of the specific types of interrogation techniques or torture that the detainment facility will use in the future. But that doesn't really matter if doctors understand that their fundamental role is to provide beneficent care, and they go to detainment facilities knowing that regardless of any interrogation technique, that it's in their interest to act in the patient's best interest. And that kind of relates to the question that they had at the end of their speech. If the patient wants to live for another day and is willing to endure potential interrogation techniques, would the doctor's presence be justified? And if the doctor and patient come to an understanding that the patient wants to live despite interrogation techniques, we'd advocate that, one, the doctor still, according to the Veracity Ethic, make known the abuses that are occurring there, and two, keep the patient alive if that's what's in the patient's best interest, and not just simply make sure that they can endure suffering for an extended period of time.
The case, it does force us to presuppose that torture is going to happen. We certainly don't condone torture, and we completely sympathize, understand, and agree with Clemson's uncomfortable feelings about the fact that torture is going on and doctors are there. But fact of the matter is that the case forces us to understand that there's a world that where torture is going on, even though we don't condone it, and where prisons occur, and we feel that given those restraints, it's our obligation to figure out how doctors can best live in such a world and make sure that prisoners aren't, say, forced to rot in the middle of a prison and instead receive the proper medical care that they're entitled to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now time for the judges' question period. I'll give them a few moments to confer.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to push you on the qualifying clause that you have in your response. You argue that you can't justify the attendance by doctors, physicians, unless their presence diminishes the chance of torture. And I'd like to ask you how you think we might reasonably and reliably predict that that presence would reduce the chance of harm, and how might we measure that going forward.
Thank you.
Okay, basically what we feel is that there's no way to know what torture would occur if the doctor's there. There's no way to go back in the future and redo things. However, what we do feel is that by a doctor being there, there's some sort of marginal benefit that we gain. Something along the lines of they can at least voice their concerns to whoever's conducting these interrogations. They can say, well, don't do that, you can injure him, or don't do that, you can hurt him. And even that provides a marginal degree of second thought on the person doing the interrogation. And to us, that provides some sort of beneficence on the part of the doctor.
Also, doctors are experts, and perhaps they can say that blow will kill him because it damages a particularly vulnerable area of the body and can perhaps save the person's life. Again, we don't like the fact that blows are going on, but perhaps being a doctor being there, as my colleague said, can provide some level of marginal utility.
A human rights observer on the ground in Darfur doesn't necessarily provide us a lot of utility or measurable utility, but we still feel that it's valuable from an ethical perspective that they're there. And the fact that doctors basically function as a human rights observer in that they're compelled to report abuses that occur makes it ethically desirable.
Thank you.
Okay, let me start with a statement. Actually, I don't think doctors are merely observers. If they were merely observers, they wouldn't have to be doctors. But let me press you on an underlying ethical point, which is this. If something really, really bad is going to happen, as I think we take it torture is, then the fact that if I participated in it, it would be a little less bad doesn't normally make it right for me to participate in. I mean, to give you an example, if my fellow judge and moderator were going to rob a bank, and I could join them and we could steal a little bit less money because I would prevent them from taking some of the money, or if they were going to beat someone up, and if I joined them in, I could make sure that he was beat up a little bit less. It's not plain to me that it would be right for me to do that. It would, no doubt, from a utilitarian perspective, but you were arguing mainly, it seems to me, from a deontological perspective. I wonder if you'd elaborate on that underlying principle.
It's a very interesting point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First point, we kind of feel that, first of all, doctors should be independent of any other co-conspirators or like the fellow bank robber, and they should just primarily use their independent judgment and ethical guidelines that they carried on from medical school to not just create reduced harm, but attempt to reverse such harm. Let's say in the case of the bank robber, a co-conspirator decided to drive the getaway car a little more slowly instead of just prevent somebody from being assaulted. I think preventing someone from being physically assaulted in the bank actually has some ethical value. But let's say they just decided to drive the getaway car a little more slowly. I don't think that would constitute our expectation of doctors in that they would reverse harm, and it would only do kind of like just a meaningless attempt to make it a little slightly more difficult, but really meaningless to prevent torturers from torturing suspects.
And also, as my colleague argued very clearly in case, that doctors were not supposed to be there in order to reap benefits. They would only be there as conscientious objectors or people there to prevent lives, whereas I assume that the co-conspirator bank robber wouldn't be there in order to make sure a passerby wasn't harmed, so much as there in order to get a share of the take.
And my assumption was that the co-conspirator would precisely be there to make sure the harm wasn't so great. And the doctor cannot be just an observer. He is part of the situation. So I think it's just not clear that that moral principle you accept has entirely wide acceptance.
I think that we revert back to the idea that perhaps the good in that situation, whether or not you're preventing harm to the extent of how much money is taken as the tangible good, in this sense, it would be how much of a life is taken, how much harm is caused to a person. That human element is, I think, very key in this case. And being that life is deontologically justified within itself, I think that it brings a new, perhaps, flavor to the issue at hand, morally.
And we also have to look, if we go back to the idea of beating someone up and the co-conspirator going there, if the person's going to be beat up whether they partake or not, and they follow along and they're able to stop just one blow, we feel that that is morally correct for them to at least try to stop them. And if they're able to stop at least one blow, then it's deontologically just.
Thank you.
This idea, I know laws have been enacted, but just the idea of these military acts and just what constitutes torture and what doesn't is still very much in place, still very much a source of debate, and many people, frankly, do believe it is torture what's being done at Guantanamo and other places, and is a debasement of American principles. Does the mere presence of a doctor there lend legitimacy to this process? And does it taint the medical profession just by association? Whatever his intent, whatever is in his heart, does he legitimize this very dubious process just by his presence?
Thank you very much for the question. Our answer is absolutely. I think it would certainly taint the medical professionals' ethical duty or the perception of medical professionals. It would be basically as if a human rights observer just stood blithely by while genocide occurred in Darfur. They go against their fundamental role in attempting to reverse human rights. They lose legitimacy in their acquiescence to a higher to greater coercive authority, and their lack of concern for a higher moral authority. And we think that this would reduce the legitimacy and reduce trust of doctors in general because they're not firmly grounded in their beneficent role.
And further that, our competitors here also brought up the idea of harming a sense of psychology in this experiments that they brought up. And in this case, a prisoner's estimation of a doctor is that beneficent role. And when they encounter a doctor that goes against those principles, it furthers the distress, the mental distress that is felt by that person, thereby delegitimizing the profession as well.
Okay, I just want to be clear. What I mean is, just by being there, do they legitimize torture? And therefore, is whatever positive derived from maybe medically supervising a person who is being interrogated lost by this legitimacy of these acts?
I think there's an ethical obligation that they make their opposition that their patients are being harmed known. And if they don't do that, then they would add legitimacy to the crime that's occurring.
It's much like a UN observer going into Darfur or to some other place in the world. As long as they make the outcry and say that what's happening isn't right, then it doesn't lend the legitimacy to it.
Thank you very much. I'll give the judges some time to finalize their scores. If we didn't know before why they're in the final round, we know now. 2 excellent presentations. Let's congratulate both teams. We brought our official scorers, Sue Murphy and Christine Most, in to check over the math. Let's give them a big hand.
Yeah, that's good.
That's great. Yeah, that was great.
Very good round.
Yeah.
going to give the judges the mic and ask them to call out their scores for each team, final score. So I'll start with Dean Peart and ask her to give me her final score for Clemson, and then her final score for Miami should be Judge 1, Professor Ellis, Judge 2, Mr. Williams, Judge 3.
Clemson 48. Miami 50.
Thanks. I gave Clemson 50 and Miami 51.
I gave Clemson 42 and Miami. I'm sorry. I gave Clemson 45 and Miami 42.
That's tied.
Sucks.
Really?
What do you do in time?
I think it's a battle royale.
Yeah. Let's just go.
Oh wait, no, I bet they take the highest differential.
As if the suspense wasn't enough. We're going to take a few minutes to make sure we have this right. We'll take a look at the rules, and we'll be right back with you. Of the rules. Tie during final match. In the case of a tie in the final match, the two finalists will be declared co-winners of the 2009 Mid-Atlantic.
Great job. Great job.
Okay, we have.
Nice job.
We had a presentation to make. There's a question of whether we still have a presentation to make. Before I do that, I want to say a few thank yous once again to the Donchian Foundation for providing the resources that made today possible. Really appreciate that. Lots of people helped for many weeks, months. I want to thank them as well. Meg McCall, Sarah Lucier, Shannon Beth, Sue Murphy, Christine Most, especially Nancy Knock, who's been contacting you daily, probably, or twice daily. Many volunteers from University of Richmond, volunteers from the We the People program at Maggie Walker Governor's School, Lance at the Parr Center at UNC, very helpful. They did it 2 years. They held this event 2 years, so we were constantly emailing them and calling Lance and asking for help. What do we do now? We appreciate that. Thanks to all the judges and moderators, many of whom came very early and spent the entire day with us. And to all of you, the teams and the coaches, for participating. Big hands. Here is what we have. So maybe we'll put this one aside, and we will get 2 of these made. And for now, maybe you can join in the middle and hold it together, and someone take a nice picture. Thank you very much. We have a reception just down the hall, prepared for 14 teams. There are fewer, so please join us.